Welcome to Wednesday Walks Together. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. As many of you have been aware, I'm reading quite a bit of Padraig Ó Tuama's works at the moment, and presently busy with his book, In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World. One of the last passages I read going to sleep last night was a passage in which he says, "What is the purpose of hope?" And I didn't really get much further than the question, but it's been playing around in my mind. And in relation to some of the things that Padraig's been saying about sin and the brokenness of the world in which we live, hope for me, from a faith perspective, always has a sense of being quite concrete. We often use the word hope in more kind of colloquial, conversational terms to mean just that something may or may not happen. I'll say, I hope to go cycling. That hope doesn't always get me on my bicycle. I've actually got to practically get changed, pump up the tires, walk out the door with the bicycle in order to go cycling. Speak about, well, we hope this, we hope that, we hope for certain gifts when birthdays and Christmas come around. We hope that the government may or may not get certain things in place for us. And most of the time when we say that, we don't have too much trust that it's going to happen. But it's a hope, it's a dream. And that's often all that it is. But when we speak about hope in the context of faith, it's something that's quite strongly attached to who we understand God to be and what we understand God to be up to. A lot of it's tied into God's activity, and particularly from a Christian perspective, through the ministry of the incarnation, the ministry of Jesus, his arrest, his crucifixion, his resurrection. And we speak quite blithely sometimes, I think, about our Christian hope, and don't always take time to really sit down and try and tie down what we really mean by that. And so Padraig's question, what is the purpose of hope, becomes an important one. Because if we're going to use the word, why are we using it? What is the purpose of that? Where is it going? And I would encourage us perhaps to find some time to reflect on that. Padraig asks that question having grappled a little bit with sin and confession, and then speaks about hope having done that. Sin, though, is something that, again, I found his thinking challenging, because he says we often confess sins that we perceive ourselves to have committed, but he says there's also the sin we live in. And are we confessing that, and are we seeking to change that? Now, what is the sin we live in? Of course, that's a good question. I can sit and think about certain things that I've done wrong, and confess those and hope that somehow that may not limit my eternal existence. But actually, it's the sin we live in that really is the sin that limits us and that stops us living life abundantly and fully. I look back over the last few years, something like the drought in Cape Town, sinfulness in the sense of just taking water and those resources for granted and just allowing water to flow away whenever I turn the tap on. There's a sinfulness in that. Towards the end of last year, we had certainly societally a huge awareness around gender-based violence. And we sought to grapple with that on a number of different and important levels. This year, with lockdown and the pandemic, racism and the importance of anti-racism has been highlighted. And doubtless we'll walk into something else in 2021. All of these things touch on the sin that we live in, almost unconsciously a lot of the time, until something happens that awakens us to the fact that actually this is not good and we need to change the way we live. And so I suspect that part of confession needs to be confessing when we become aware of the sin in which we live, confessing that, And of course, connected to confessing something is actually then committing to changing. That we would bring that sinful element of life to an end. When one looks at racism and recognizes how institutionalized it so often is, gender-based violence, how it's just ingrained that is in our society, a simple confession certainly is insufficient in actually dealing with it. And even my own awareness and changing the way I live is not going to change the wider breadth of its impact on the lives of everybody in the society that I live. But I think there's something, and I think perhaps this is where hope begins to impact and come into it, is that as I become aware and as I begin to confess that which I perceive to be wrong around me and of which I am in some form complicit, and personally seek to live differently, and beyond that to have the courage to actually call those who live around me to live differently, that there is actually hope in that we can change and grow. And perhaps that's an element of the purpose of hope in our lives, is that there is always something pulling us forward that says this present evil, or this present awareness of this evil or sin or wrongdoing, actually it can be dealt with. But it takes an ongoing awareness, an ongoing memory, a willingness to hold and to continue to work with what we perceive to be broken in not only our personal existences, but in the broader society that we're all part of. And so I would ask that we find ways to, and I ask this with not necessarily having any clear or easy answer to it, but that we find ways not to forget. It's so easy, as we've had sufficient rain and there's sufficient water in the dams at the moment, not to be too worried about whether the tap runs while I brush my teeth in the morning, or whether I use the hose pipe instead of a bucket. It's easy to kind of forget that because there's sufficient. The gender-based violence issues, well, kind of, we did a whole lot of thinking about that, and now there's another crisis and there's something else on, but to continue to hold that awareness, and where we find attitudes and actions that still hold that brokenness, to challenge them nonetheless, whatever the next crisis is we're dealing with. Racism, again, something not new, but it's manifesting differently today than it did a year ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 400 years ago. And we need to be aware, and we need to hold, and we need to find ways to be part of the healing. And the healing really is about relationship and finding ways to move forward together, and in a way that actually will really make a difference to people's lives. And it begins with me in my relationship with those close to me, with you, with God, and with the world in which I live. And that, for me, is part of the purpose of hope.